So what we wanted to do this morning was just to share a little bit about, ostensibly around the self-evaluation we've done around about the SDS standards, but I suppose more generally just get people's thoughts about the value of self-evaluation itself, how it can contribute. Is it? I guess it's almost that legitimacy. Is there a question as well, self-evaluation, how valuable really is that when it comes to governance? You almost, that notion that we need to be externally validated by other organisations in order to be almost as it were trusted, and that's not a kind of disparity to inspection organisations, including my own, but it is just something about recognising how we value stuff, how we are convinced that things are making a difference, or how we are convinced that they are working in the right direction. So self-evaluation, it's an interesting one. So I just wanted to kind of really kind of share a little bit about the journey we've been on with that in terms of the SDS standards, but to kind of prompt that question about how valuable is this, and there's some folk on the call today who've been involved in the SDS one, so you can certainly hear from themselves as well. Ian and Michelle, that's a wee heads up, if you're okay with that. So if I can just share screen, hopefully this comes up okay. Let's just make sure. Open, yeah, that should be up and running. Now, I'm just going to move things around a wee bit, just so I can see chat as well. Grand. There we go. So yeah, valuing self-evaluation. It's having a look at it as a process. There will be a session in the new year where we'll be sharing more of the detail that actually came from this process in terms of SDS standards and where we are with it. This isn't about so much the content; it's more about the process of it. And I just wanted to kind of talk through and get people's views on. So I'll do a little bit of scene setting. We'll give a summary of the SDS self-evaluation itself, and some high-level learning points from that, because as I say, the main learning points will come once the final report is out and we run a session on that. And then some pointers to what this means going forward, how we might use self-evaluation as an absolutely valid tool. And actually, perhaps it'd be interesting to see if other people feel it's more valuable. Opportunities for Q&A. What I would suggest is if you want, as you go along, by all means put things in the chat, and we'll pick them up as we go, and certainly there'll be time to kind of put hand up and ask questions as well at the end. Be good to hear experience any others have in self-evaluation. So if this is work, if you've been involved in it in other guises, that would be useful to hear about. And then thinking about what the opportunities are going forwards for using this as an approach more broadly. So can I just ask in the chat, just now, just putting in, have you been involved in any self-evaluation process before? That would be useful to know. So just even pinging that in almost as a yes or no at the moment, it's something that we can pick up on. So already seen a yes in there, so that's great. So that will hopefully feed into the conversation later about what that's been like and what people's experience of that has been in comparison to be externally evaluated. So current system of predominated by external evaluation, and there's lots of different aspects of evaluation. So when it's good, it's looking at outcomes. It's thinking about performance carefully, rather than it being entirely performance driven. I'll come to that in a wee second. Looking at what impact, this is what the governance aspect of this, and that means governance, in my view, governance from organisational point of view, but also, especially in the terms of SDS, ultimately from people's point of view, how is it that people in Scotland can see that SDS is or isn't making, and we all know the challenge of that just now in terms of being well past the 10-year mark on the strategy, and it's still not been embedded. So that external validation has been in place all of that time, and yet we're still not there. So there is a question immediately in there is about whether we're getting that style of external evaluation right, but also there might be something about internal and self-evaluation which may help us move forward more purposefully, and certainly you'll hear a bit about that in the feedback from the work that we've done so far. That does seem to suggest that people are beginning to see opportunities for improvement much more clearly when the self-evaluation methodology has been used. So looking at impact, and I think performance and targets, KPIs, key performance indicators, all of these things, well, they certainly fill me with dread. And they are also linked then to some of the stuff on that right-hand side about traditional performance measurement and management. These are the things that were driving us to think about self-evaluation because we wanted to do something differently. Um, and those perverse outcomes and corruption of data, it sounds really strong language, but there is a huge amount of evidence in this. Anybody who's familiar with the human learning system work and Toby Lowe's stuff can point you to the wealth of evidence there is, where he talks of 75% of work having gaming within the data, and of that 80% that being very deliberate gaming of data. And that sounds as though it's very I don't know, very mischievous and almost deliberate in a negative way, but actually a lot of that is because people are trying to do the right thing and about putting their best foot forward. But it does mean that you hide, in effect, the real area for learning. So when is it not working? What's not working? How do we understand that? And if you're always being measured in a way which is external and about, and there's a very salient point at the moment in terms of the head teacher in England, and that case being covered at the moment, and the impact of that when it's done at its worst. And I wouldn't suggest that every external evaluation is like that, but when it's done at its worst, it has really horrible outcomes. And it's not something that brings to light any understanding of what's actually going on. So these are the things about the current system that we were concerned about, is that it's, and I absolutely want to make clear, I'm not saying that all external evaluation is negative, but there is something about it that we're not necessarily in a place where we're bringing forward real learning, because it doesn't necessarily encourage that. It encourages a mindset of success or failure. So another wee question just before we go into this next slide, it'd be interesting to see whether people, and it's interesting that quite a few have been involved. Do you think we can trust the self-evaluation? It'd be interesting, again, just put that down as a yes no at the moment, and we'll pick that up when we look at the transcripts to get a sense of what that looks like. But whether people feel that we can trust self-evaluation in terms of, I suppose, anything, but SDS would be the obvious one, given that's what we're talking about just now. So it'd be just interesting to get a sense of whether people feel that we can trust a self-evaluation process just now. Okay, so could it be different? And that was it. That was what's in our mindset when we were looking at the SDS standards. Could we do this differently? Could we do something which would pick up on that all of this works within complexity of people's lives? This is about people living their lives. It's not about what I would call simple or complicated improvement cycles of, for example, fixing broken legs. We understand how to do that, and we can continuously improve that process, heart surgery, etc., etc. But when it comes to understanding improvement within the context of something SDS, people's lives are complex. All of our lives are complex. And again, if you've seen the HLS stuff, you've seen the obesity map round about complexity. They're enormously complex. It's not a case of if you do A, we get to B, and then C, and then D. It's never a straight road like that. So how are we going to understand what is going on in our system with an eye to improvement? So we wanted to look at self-evaluation because we felt it gave us something where we could really ask slightly different questions. So so that kind of first question before even looking at data is, what is the purpose of what we measure? So and what we were keen is we will measure to understand, learn, and improve. And that was the key thing, is we needed to understand in order to learn and then improve. We will work with providers to, and what we mean by that is across all aspects of how we engage, especially in the commissioning environment, to co-produce meaningful measures. So it's working with everybody to get meaningful measures, working with what matters to people, recognise complexity, and ensuring different voices can be heard in the measures. So that very much that co-production space. So practically how to measure a system that's still delivering performance means that what we knew is that we wouldn't be able to entirely ditch performance mindset, and it's something that in terms of the national improvement plan around SDS, we will have a combination of those, but the aim will be to triangulate between what we've got by old measures and what we have by way of new measures, which maybe bring more information. People might be familiar with work done quite a few years ago now by Vanguard, and the title of their report was "Saving Money by Doing the Right Thing," and that notion that within public sector in particular, that a lot of what we're aiming at is to do it within the public purse, and the public purse incredibly challenged at the moment, and that's only going to get worse. But if you focus simply on saving money, there's a lot of poor decisions that are made. If you focus on what matters, the evidence again suggests that you actually can do things more effectively within the budget you have. I'm not sure the narrative of saving money is ever useful. You have the budget you have. How do you spend it most effectively? So you do need something that triangulates, and you begin to see that actually those things which matter financially matter in that measured system also tend to go in the right direction. And if not, then we need to understand why. Um, so it's not just enough to tell the story, you have to sell the story. So in other words, you have to really be able to convince, and I think this is where we've been with what is often kind of pointed in terms of qualitative data, that it's anecdotal. And that's a word which is used an awful lot to disempower it. That's just anecdotal. It's a nice story and it illustrates a point, but it's anecdotal. But actually, I would argue that very often what you're doing with that, if you do it well, is to illustrate a point and using it for that purpose, not just as an anecdotal um, measurement. So being able to sell the data and be able to say this is convincing data and here's why. And people remember the story and the relevant financial figures. So like that, getting that marriage of yes, the right story and the figures that go with it. So this was the backdrop of why we were looking at self-evaluation. Um, so in developing the SDS standards, with a clear desire to also develop a self-evaluation frame infrastructure that helps health and social care partnerships and their partners, if you remember that point about doing that collaboratively, understand how they implement SDS within the standards. So that's what we were aiming to do. And we established a group to kind of lead on that. And a small number, or so there's 3 HSCPs who willingly put up their hands and said, actually, you know what, this does feel as though this would give us the opportunity to really get into what matters locally to people in our areas and to be able to develop action plans on the back of that. So we brought together a couple of things. There's a few, but a couple of main things in terms of people familiar with the work done by Matter of Focus. It's built on work that's been around by people who run that organisation. It's been around for a wee while in terms of meaningful and measurable as well. So that what matters, focusing on what matters. So the outcome-based approach is like really understanding about how we understand impact in terms of actually outcomes in people's lives, and that being the focus, and that being aligned to part of the human learning system thinking and a very simple noticing framework. So looking at uh, what we've got in terms of outcome capabilities and patterns. So how effective individuals or organisations are at sensing and responding, so understanding how they observe and then respond to that. How easy it is to sense and respond. So is the capacity there to do that, and whether there are predictable differences in practice, behaviour, and context. So it's a very simple methodology about noticing. Sounds like such a benign thing that it's just observing, but in this context, it's about how you actively notice things. So not the things which are often implicit, making them explicit, and then having discussions saying what is that telling us. So the observation, that the noticing becomes alive when you then are discussing that, saying what does that mean to us, and discussing it in that partnership way. So this isn't just about the public sector's view on it. It's not just about providers' view on it. It's not just about our citizens' views on it. It's about bringing those views together to then get a shared understanding. And you can see there that coming together then, and you'll be familiar with the picture in the middle in terms of the Social Work Scotland having pulled this together is that this is how we see all these bits coming together in terms of enhanced worker skills practice and autonomy, better systems and culture, and better leadership. So this is the aim of all this work. So it's a self-evaluation so that we are driving this kind of improvement and using that with a learning approach to do it. So what we did was a 100-day test, which was slightly arbitrary, I have to say. We knew that we needed to give people enough time to test this approach, but we also needed um, to put a limit on it. And one of the concerns would be with a learning approach, you're always learning. So it's a continuous learning, continuous improvement, continuous learning. So how do we cut it off at a point where we can actually look at it? And we arrived on it's quite a tried and tested model, kind of either 90-day or 100-day trials. And in this essence, it was about a 90-day with 10 days for us to reflect at the end of it. But basically, you could see that what we were doing was we were having three kind of sets of, on a monthly basis, looking at what's happening in the three sites. So it was Highland, East Ayrshire, and Moray. What's happening in each of those sites, and then what was important was the critical friends coming together. So myself, Jane, and Jane Scott coming together to say. So we were having those conversations with each site, and then for us to come together to look at what is it that we are hearing from each of them, our observations on that, and then bringing that together and feeding it back to those sites so that what you're getting is a building of the conversations and understanding. So it's not simply um, a narrative, they saw this, they saw this, and they saw this, but actually, so my thoughts when I was hearing this were, and we're beginning to develop an understanding and then checking that with each other and then checking it back. So you begin to create a much more dynamic learning framework there where you've got checks and balances of people who are observing and that kind of coaching critical friend role, feeding back, then discussing it with others who are doing a similar role and feeding that back as well and doing that 3 times over. So what you're getting was a real building of learning. And this is where you begin to get the governance coming in. So it's not simply self-evaluation on the basis of going away with paperwork and saying, we've looked at ourselves and we think we're great. It's much more about actually, here's what we're hearing, here's what we're learning about our local sites, here's our observations, it's making me think this. But you've got a critical friend, a coach saying, I'm wondering what that means, can you tell me a bit more about? And you're building that all along the way and you're making it very transparent and visible. And as somebody who comes from a commissioning procurement background, that transparency is such an important point of public sector, is that we need, and this is where you get real governance, because it's also then information which you're making visible straight back to those who are involved. So people from staff who are involved at local levels, and that they're hearing that conversation coming back round to them as a kind of 360 idea, and being able to then clarify and check in with points. So on a 100-day trial, this is the meat of this you will get at the early part of next year once we're able to bring that report together. But what was interesting was some kind of high-level learning points. Was what we saw there was, first one was agency of workers. So all being feeling that they're part of an improvement journey. All too often for staff, and this is, you got to remember these standards are sensibly about how staff are able to implement SDS. It is based on also what people's experience is, but it's really focused on how organisations are implementing it. So for staff to have agency, um, it's it's such an important thing, especially at this point where we are bereft of resources across health and social care. You want every member of staff to have as much agency as possible, because what you don't want is to have people who are just waiting to be told what to do next. And to a large extent, that's where staff have been. It's about complying with legislation, and yes, you do have to do that, but it's become very much a top-down system. This is both health and social care have been top-down, driven by policy. And these policies are correct, but they have taken away a lot of agency from individual members of staff. And how do you kind of? It's interesting that what was coming through in this was seeing people feeling that, once again, that agency, that they had an opinion, that they not just had an opinion, but an informed opinion based on their experience, and that experience was being listened to, and that it was being used to make things better. So that agency for workers was enormous, and you know that it's one of the threads of the SDS standards is worker autonomy. Aligned to that is confidence. Um, that was in a lots of different aspects, and an interesting one was where um, a recognition that actually that one of the places felt we've started kind of in the wrong place. So after 30 days, a third of the way in, normally you'd think, right, I have to keep going because we're starting this way. We don't want to look as though we failed in this, but actually having that courage to go, this wasn't the right place, and to start again, um, and to say actually where we really need to look at is based on what we've learned in this first month is over here. That's not something I think you would normally get from an external evaluation because it does feel as though there's a huge sense of failure in there. But actually, that recognition is no, that's our learning point. Is there something much more important over in this part of it? And we need to kind of reset and think about it again. So having that confidence to do things like that. Um, Leadership is necessary to lead from front, um, and not being that kind of leaders are right behind us. So giving permission is great, and that leading from the front in that respect and saying, "Yeah, I've got your back. You know, just go ahead, proceed until apprehended." All these things they are really useful. But actually, what was really more important in this leadership was while leading from the front, there was the "What do you need me to do?" kind of leadership. So it was about problem solving. It was an action. It was saying, if you identify to me something I need to do differently or something I need to go and speak to somebody else to make happen, then I'll go and do that. And that's the kind of leadership. So using the power that leadership does have to go and effect change, but driving that change from what matters to people, both in terms of staff and therefore what matters to people, because that's where that's coming from. So and recognizing that success can really only be sustained when you've kind of got that level of leadership buy-in where they're fully on board and committed. That it only goes as far as that. So if your leadership level only goes halfway up the organization, then the organization doesn't really change and the whole system doesn't change. So there's something really important about getting that leadership all the way through. Pace has to be in line with the resources that can support it. So the risks are otherwise you get forced change or a lack of proper understanding. And we see this with new policy very often is that people are having to respond. What was interesting about this was again is about getting the pace of that. So within the 100 days, it was always about getting as far as you get within 100 days. It wasn't saying we expect you to get to a certain destination, because what we wanted to understand is how far do you get in terms of self-evaluation and understanding and improving. And there were certainly varying degrees. But what was interesting, all three sites started in slightly different scales of their work. Some whole system, some much more closer to one part of the system, but they all when we fed back, they all came together and recognised each other's stories, and there was a lot of similarity. So, although they started in different places, and this is one of the things about self-evaluation, where's the consistency? But it was against the same set of standards, so there was consistency, and people actually learned very similar aspects, but they learned them in slightly different ways. And when we brought the peer group together, it was one of the key things you can see at the bottom there, peer support. Actually, that's where a lot of that came out, was that you were having the three sites being able to bounce off each other and say, we heard we heard something this way, and others saying, I heard something similar but in a different way. So you're beginning to understand things differently. And sometimes saying, well, we heard a different thing. We actually had a different aspect in relation to that. And you're able to explore that and understand it as well. So it gave the opportunity to again get a real richness to the learning from that. And it says there, an active implementation which underpins all of this. That methodology talks about the four stages there, and in particular, we're spending a long time in the first stage. So it's a bit of that kind of carpenter's rule. It's like, was it measure twice and cut once? It's that kind of notion. It's like your exploration. It's also in service design thinking, spending time in the messy space. And again, going back to that example where people had confidence to say, we've started in slightly the wrong place. We need to reset and do that. So getting your exploration stage. Are we understanding this well and properly? And then, since I picked up in peer support already, that critical friends was something that allowed them to have that external, that kind of coaching role. So I speak to my own experience of it, and I'm sure Jane will as well. But it was very. I was certainly learning every single conversation. It wasn't about. It's not about. Again, it's not about external expert. It is about an external reasonably, I'd like to think, intelligent voice, being able to offer something back, and challenge not just the thinking there, but also our own thinking about saying, that's something different from what I expected, or there's something in that we've seen. I've not heard that before. And actually, in that kind of critical friend role, you've got somebody who can be separate from the day-to-day experience of it, but can understand it enough to be able to help them to dig in and learn. So those are the high-level learnings from that. So where we're looking to kind of go next is to roll this out. So we have, in effect, done the testing, not quite in a lab, but testing of the idea of self-evaluation. And the next one would be what we would call beta testing in IT language. So there's a big opportunity. There were quite a few other partnerships who expressed interest a few months ago in being involved and being able to roll this out and test it in a kind of beta version, so that it's now that we've gone through the questions, now we understand how they work, being able to go back out with a slight reiteration of the framework, and test that at a larger scale. But again, to do that in a way which is kind of incremental, so building the evidence, using what the three have learned, sharing that, and creating that peer space that allows that information to be understood, not just from our point of view, but in a collective way. And also to say that in terms of, I think I've mentioned already, the SD improvement plan, the monitoring and evaluation of there has also been done in a similar way, where we're using the kind of questions which are around learning. So it won't be self-evaluation that way, but we're using the same kind of approach in terms of a learning approach alongside a data approach. So that's an outline, and if I'm going to bring back the screen so I can see everybody. Just an opportunity. The bits are really kind of any Q&A. It'd be good to hear other people's experience on the self-evaluation process, and then it'd be great to then think about any opportunities that we think might be around to do more of this. So I'm going to stop sharing. It's over. Margaret Petherbridge, sorry.
Hi, Des. Good to
You're
see
getting
you.
your full name. I don't know why you're getting your full name, but I just thought, in case there's more than one Margaret.
So I just wondered, because one of the things that can be quite difficult about this is where you've got, particularly where you've got a group of people that are seen as being the kind of SDS people within the organisation to take SDS forward, and trying to get that kind of engagement, I suppose you might call it, with others within the organisation to make sure that you can do a really good self-evaluation and take that forward. Sometimes you've got that really good engagement, and I'm talking here about commissioning, finance, legal, all that kind of stuff, but sometimes there's gaps in it, and I just wondered what the kind of test group's experience of that was, and how that was kind of tackled, overcome, discussed, that kind of thing. Because it, interesting in terms of how what you were talking about in terms of leadership, I think there can be a lot of assumptions made by leadership, and I'm talking about long experience across the years. I'm not just talking about just now, but assumptions made about what's happening and how things are going. And it was Claire Roxburgh that said in one of our SDS meetings recently that they actually went back to their leaders and said, "What do you need from us?" Rather than saying, "Here's what we're doing. What is it you want us to be doing?" Which is a really, I'm got a meeting next week, and that's exactly the question I'm going to be asking. It kind of turns it on its head a wee bit. So just interested in that aspect of it, because after obviously we've COVID stalled a lot of things and made, disrupted a lot of people's support. So we're still playing catch up with that and trying to kind of look at how we implement in a way that is going to address that, but also just to try and keep people with us while we're doing it.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Can I be really cheeky and ask Ian to come in, because Ian made quite a few points about this, both in terms of his role as and as you say, it's that kind of the direct leader of this, the person who is most, like yourself, that's where SDS is seen as being part of one part of the organisation. It's that siphoning off to the side, which has been very unhelpful, I think, in making this the way we do all of social work. So there, yeah, Ian's had that role, but he also talked quite a lot about the support he received from his own leaders as well, the other leaders in the organisation. Is Ian, are you there? Would you be okay to come in and talk a wee about that? Because I think you had some really helpful insights to that point.
Well, I'll try to. So I think I can see the danger, Margaret, very clearly that you kind of in a corner and it's an STS world and it kind of sits discreetly from the rest of it. When we involved ourselves in the self-evaluation, we tried to get representatives across the system at pretty much at the kind of operational level. So yeah, we did have some contracts, but we didn't have very many senior managers around the table as we self-evaluated. But we did try to really understand the operation of our adult social care system rather than talking about the niceties of self-directed support or direct payments and different options. That became part of the discussion, certainly, but it really we tried to allow people to comment, I think, on the practice and culture that they found around them and trying to affect adult social care rather than thinking just around about STS specifically. And just your point, Des, yeah, I think it was important that we got organisational support. I didn't want to ask the same question as Claire, which was us asking of our leaders, what do they want from us? I wanted to ask of our staff, what did they needed what did they need from us to be able to do their jobs in the way that they wanted to really make an impact and help people make an impact in their own lives. So that was where we came from, but we had to spend some time making sure that we had the kind of well, ducks in a row organisationally, so people when they offered their opinions were heard and we were able to try to affect change, and we're still in that process on the basis of what we heard is from the self-evaluation. But people cast it pretty broadly. They really talked about their working lives, their lived experience, and the challenges they faced across adult social care. I think there was a danger that we went up a kind of self-directed support cul-de-sac, but I don't think we did that. I think that people were able to talk about the system more generally.
Thanks, Ian. That's really helpful. Thank you. Margaret, is that helpful? Is there anything you wanted to come back on that just before we move on to the next one?
No, I think that is really helpful, and we do hear from our frontline staff a lot about what they think they need, and it's things like, getting released to attend training sessions, etc., when there's so many other priorities can be really, really difficult. But you have to invest that time in order to make the improvements, and it's a false economy not to do that. But obviously in current climate it's quite difficult to do that at times. But that's really helpful, Ian, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, for that. Thanks, Margaret. Jasmine.
So it's just a question about, how did you find within the self-evaluation model that there were, that you got the checks and balances right, or do you feel that this model tends to self-right, particularly in reference to promoting good outcomes and ensuring good accountability of the resources available? But we're in a situation where a lot of councils use resource panels, and there's charging for social care in many cases. How do you think this sort of the reliance on a self-evaluation will right itself, to get an appropriate assessment?
I mean, you're cutting to the chase in terms of the governance part of it, and I think that is a challenge. It can be seen as being, well, marking your own kind of homework. I think the main way, my observation anyway, the main way was having such, as Ian said, such a wide audience of people, so you make it very visible to all, as it were. And then having those kind of layers of, you've got your internal checks and balances, but you also have, and that's the thing about it, that's one of the things that we as critical friends, myself and both James, were reflecting on. we could see why that role was so essential, is that you have an external voice being able to bring in a challenge, because the challenge is more about how are you identifying opportunities for improvement. What struck me was that all three sites identified quite a number of improvements. So there is an inherent dissatisfaction with the current system, and those who are involved in it recognizing exactly, you say, Ian, I hope you don't mind me saying that one of the things that they're looking at by way of a test of change is around eligibility itself, which I'm not sure through an external process that you're going to throw up your eligibility criteria, or the eligibility process has been something you want to have a bigger look at. So the kinds of tests of change, I think, are a marker of that, because actually they've not shied away from really important aspects, eligibility being one of the most obvious ones. They have looked at permissioning around resource panels as well, and again, how they can become lighter in doing that and getting the proportionality in it as well. So the things that they've identified in their improvement plans, I think, are a marker as well. It's something we need to keep alive to, and I think transparency and having a learning approach around it, so others being able to come in with that kind of coaching, challenging way, but with a view to saying, how do we drive improvement here, not have you passed or failed. So I think that's where it comes from, and it seems to be working, but that's why we need to do the second round of testing. It seems to have come through quite strongly in these three, and I'll see other hands going up, so there may well be others who want to comment on that have been involved. In fact, can I come to Alistair, because you were involved in some of the conversations in Highlands? I don't know if you want to pick up on that point, or if you want to ask a separate question.
Yeah. I think there was a couple of different points, I guess, that I was interested to just follow up on. I think one of the issues is about the integrity and the power balance when you're doing these things. It's very easy for it to still feel like it's a very fixed expectation around about what's okay to ask about. And I think we made the effort, certainly in the Highland one that we're involved in, to really open it up and to make it feel safe to have anything on the agenda. So like we said there, otherwise all you end up with is you can be too explicit with your agenda and say, well, this is what matters to us. And so go and tell us where you think we're doing on these axes. And then the danger with that is then you totally miss something that's off your radar, that's a massive blocker for somebody else, or that's a huge stressor, but it's just not hitting your radar. And so that integrity, that willingness to listen, no shortcuts and not shutting things down. So taking a bit of time to explore, and that also just feeds to that trust element. And like I say, when I've seen this not go so well on an organisational basis in another agency, some of that was down to the fact that when the feedback started coming out, and it was quite critical because there hadn't been an avenue to be constructively critical for a while because it had just been shut down. It was seen as, oh, well, this is all negative, so we're just going to stop doing it. So I would urge people to brace themselves if they have, if there is going to be stuff that come out that's going to be uncomfortable that we want to hear, to stick with that, to actually follow through with all of that, because it is worth it. Because very few occasions is it just people doing it for the sake of it. Usually behind it, there's something that we can understand and do better. And like I say, I felt that the effort with the Highland one was that there was a lot of effort made to minimise the power differentials, to really understand and to take the time to go through things so everybody really felt part of it. There wasn't shortcuts, and I think that's what pays dividends in the longer term. You might think it's less efficient because you may get pulled in a few other directions, but actually you're building the foundations for people to come back saying, well, you know what, they didn't balk at this. They took that and we followed up with that with some good solid learning. So I just wanted to make those observations and just feed that back.
Thanks, Alistair. And I think you hit a point there, particularly at the end there, about we've talked a lot in the past about things like trust-based commissioning and the importance of relationships, etc. And I think that's what I was hearing there, is that ultimately that's what you're beginning to build, which is fairly alien to the way our system has been running. So I think that would take time, but thanks. Janie.
Morning, everyone. I suppose my question, and I've been involved in lots of this stuff as well. I think, we're all coming from a place making the assumption that we have a kind of shared values, shared vision. The reality on the ground and the coalface is that lots of areas don't share these values and vision. And arguably they're the areas that probably need to be doing this more than the captive audience that you had in the Highlands and Moray, etc. How is this going to work in those areas, and how do we get the buy-in, and how do we change the ethos and values before we can even start this process? I just feel at the moment there's a naivety and a real disconnect between some of the policy and what's actually happening in the ground for people. It bears no resemblance to people's lived experiences of how this has been implemented. Yeah, so how can we address some of that?
I think you're right, Janie, and I think that's the thing that often, and that's obviously it's the most obvious concern about self-evaluation, that would allow, in shorthand, rogue to continue to be rogue type thing. And absolutely agree with that. I think you're right. It's about how do we make, so it's going to be important in self-evaluation processes. How do you demonstrate that you are that listening to the voice of people's experience? How is that demonstrated in your self-evaluation? That it's not, when we say self-evaluation, almost sounds it's entirely inward looking. It needs to be built on something. So it needs to be seen, so, and what's your evidence for that? So there is, and I think that's the role, for example, of Critical Friends. There's a bit for me, if I'm honest, is that it goes back to, I think, an external, one of the issues about the current way of external evaluation, and again, this isn't a criticism of organisations doing it, it's the process itself, is that it doesn't lend itself to bringing forward the things that don't work, which is, go back to that point, is that those things have been actively or I don't know, it's not inactively, have been hidden. I think that's the thing, that the current way of doing it doesn't encourage anybody. If you've ever read Black Box Thinking, that's within the health service of that, there is no encouragement to bring forward the dirty linen, the things that don't work, the real problems. So we continue to have a presentation that we've increased the number of option 2s. Well, was that choice, or was that was that just because you've no choice, you'll only get it? Or option 1 is probably the one, it's like you're only getting option 1 because we haven't got anything else. But there's no encouragement to give people space, because it feels as though I've done something wrong. Well, I'm damn well not going to tell anybody I've done something wrong, am I? Because I'm going to be held out to dry for it. So I think part of the thing is, and I think that was what was interesting, was seeing some of the big things that came through in the self-evaluation were things I don't think you would have seen otherwise. Now, in the most challenging of areas, places where that's most embedded, that kind of having dug yourself in a place where things aren't great, and it's hard to then say that. That's going to be a real challenge, and I guess that's part of our role, is to be able to, but I think it's maybe a reasonable challenge to lay to people like myself, Janie, is that how, if we're supporting other partnerships, how do we help make that really obvious and encourage people to say, now is the time to address these issues, because our way of doing it in the past 10 years hasn't got us there. So
and what we hear from leadership is that everything is hunky-dory, but what I hear from people in receipt of services is it's completely broken. Now, granted, in my role, I only really hear from the folk that it's not working for, but it's not working for more and more people than it was 2-3 years ago. So that's deeply concerning, in spite of all our work. And, I'm really passionate about self-directed support. But it's kind of been bastardized by some areas, and that's hugely concerning. Yeah,
and I think the important thing will be to understand exactly why that is, how do we bring forward the learning to understand why it's got worse in those areas? Because again, there are no motives to bring that forward. And the challenge is that it continues to be a narrative with no substance behind it. So how do we create the right space for the substance to come through and say, what is it? What's the problem? And how might we start addressing some of that? There'll be some very, very challenging and possibly unsolvable aspects. We know that money is becoming less and less. So, but let's be clear about, so what are the things that we can do and how do we begin to do that? So, and keep making the point, Janie, because you're right. I think that's the bit that we need to get to. We need to be getting it across the whole of Scotland that we've actually got things beginning to turn in the right direction again. Now I'm seeing that there are 4 people's hands up, but I'm only seeing one picture. Hold on a second. Amanda.
Thank you. No, I was really interested in what people were saying about how self-evaluation's gone in those areas. That was really interesting, and what Janie said there has kind of prompted me just to think about feedback and how we get that, because what struck me about all of this so far, there's loads of fascinating bits. It's making me think about what we're doing and how we challenge things. But I think at the beginning of it, you've got to not make assumptions about what people in areas are saying, people who receive services, but also people who are waiting for services. You know, I think there's a really, it's important to engage with, I think, the public at the really early stage, but I think people worry about, well, people might think we're offering an extra funding stream. And even with people who want to make changes, I've noticed that in different parts of the system, people can take a little bit of SDS and think that's going to solve a bit of their problem. So I completely get that thing that someone was saying about siphoning off. And I'm really interested as to how you can work across. And I know you're thinking about like almost like whole system change. The bit that I'd done in terms of with others in terms of adult support and protection was to do with really trying to get proper data to start with in a small way, very small samples over a long period of time, to find out what is the quality of people's experiences just through our case records. And it's kind of starting small, but that has been able to be maintained based on the kind of standards. It includes SDS in that tool of what we do. People have bought into it because the workers get feedback of what they've done in the conversations, and it's not just about the numbers. But it's just a call to say about how do we listen to people who are receiving or waiting for services better to inform it, rather than assuming that what our systems tell us or what is actually being delivered is all of the story. Don't know if that makes any sense, but it was just, these are the thoughts that came to my mind.
No, absolutely, and you're right. There is, it's especially now there are a lot of people who are not known to the system as the language. It's a terrible way of putting it, but yeah, who are not yet engaged, or who are engaged in the terms of that waiting space, the kind of what would have been called unmet need. And I guess that's exactly the point of how are we understanding communities more widely. Ian, I see your hand up, and I wondered if, because I know again that you may well be coming in with another point, but I know that part of your process was to look in much more wide kind of community way of understanding demand rather than specifically people who are currently using services. So I don't know if there's anything that you can say on that. You may well, as I say, have your hand up for an entirely different point.
I wanted to kind of come back on what Jasmine had said quite a bit back, so that's a wee while but ago in the conversation, and it was really around about, but it does think about some of the system components of it nevertheless. I think Jasmine was kind of asking around a bit to what extent we can assure ourselves that we've got a balanced assessment if we're just involved in a self-assessment. okay, so that was one of the things I was going to deal with, and the other thing was really around about, you know, what happens when you just look at performance, and where does that sit against a system that isn't working, and that's Janie's point to some extent. So I think there's a real danger here that if you focus just on performance against and performance data, you're implicitly saying, oh, you might be saying you know, the performance data is poor, but you're still implicitly accepting that the system that you're operating is one that can be improved, and that the system doesn't in need of change. So for instance, we had an adult protection inspection that said, you know, your timescales against investigations is poor. Okay, our timescales against investigation is poor. That doesn't tell us in any way, shape or form why our performance against investigations is poor, because we don't understand the practice of the culture that sits behind that. We don't know if our system's operating or our system's broke. People told us, however, that our system was broke, Janie, when we asked them. So looking at that balanced assessment that Jasmine's looking for, they're complementary. I think you need to look at performance information, but that doesn't tell you anything to some extent in terms of how your system's operating. It just tells you that you're not performing. It doesn't give you the why. And really, this self-evaluation is required to give you the understanding and learning of the practice and culture that will lead to some of those components, and an understanding of what is happening within the system that's producing this poor performance. Now, there are a number of, as you say, Des, there are lots of factors in human learning. You know, there's lots of different factors. So the outcomes for individuals are not all dependent on the input from social workers. That's absolutely clear within that. But nevertheless, you know, to understand how that system is operating, the process within it, you need to speak to people who are in there. Just, you know, if I take the timescales against investigations and I put that back, it's a blunt instrument and I have no ownership. So I'm just saying to social workers, improve your timescale against investigations. There's no dialogue and there's no understanding. Yeah. So it just creates heat that creates absolutely no light. It doesn't understand how they're working. It doesn't understand how they're interacting with adults at risk. It doesn't understand the outcomes that they're trying to seek and why they're trying to seek it. I'm just saying improve, and that's that gaming that Des starts talking about. So I think they're complementary. I think you have to see them in the round. I think it's not that performance isn't important. It is. It's not that the outcomes for individuals isn't important. They are, although that's difficult data to get. But then it's an understanding of how the system's operating to produce these both outcomes and performance measures, if you like. And I think that that's been what's been really interesting as we've started to dig in there. And I can assure you, in terms of self-evaluation, nobody was trying to gameplay that I heard in terms of making it sound better than it was. When people turned up, it didn't appear to me that their intention was to make the system and the way that we work appear better than it is. They were fairly straightforward in telling us some of the shortcomings of the system that we've put in place.
Thanks, Ian. That's great. I am mindful of time, and Anne-Marie, I know you've been waiting a wee while, but I'm also keen to come back to Jane at the end. So, Anne-Marie, did you want to come in?
Yes, sorry. I'm just really enjoying hearing everyone's views. I just wanted to agree with Janie and what she was saying. My current area, I've made arrangements to speak to people in more detail later after this meeting, but the system is totally broken down in this area. And I'm not speaking about from the service user's point of view, which is dire because it's not happening coming through to us. It's the practitioners here, everyone involved, the joint partnership are really struggling because their leadership are not helping them try and fix the problem so that it can actually followed through. They're quite desperate for help in this area because I'm sure they want to fix it and try to find a way around why it's not working, but they're just not getting the support to do it, and it's just not happening. So I just wanted to back up. I totally agree with what Janie was saying, and I also wanted to agree with the person that just spoke as well. That's all.
Thanks, Anne-Marie, and I think it's a really helpful point that you make, in particular that people wanting to make the difference but struggling to know how to. And I guess that's part of this, is that we know that the current system hasn't been making the difference that we've all been looking for. And part of, as you saw at the beginning, part of that was this driver for us, is to come with a different approach. We needed a different way to kind of to begin to understand, exactly as Ian said. We knew good or bad, we knew why, we didn't know, and beginning to really get into that, and as we come through. Can I cheat here and break a rule here, because I know I've got a 1 which is Jane and a 2 which is Michelle, but Jane, are you okay that I finish on you, as it were? Thank you. I thought you might be. Michelle, do you want to come in, and then we'll go to Jane to close up? Thanks.
Yeah, I think just to kind of reiterate what some people have said, we had a system that we knew wasn't working, so we looked in terms of self-evaluation. It was that process for unpaid carers who meet eligibility for SDS. So our primary stakeholder was our unpaid carers. We had other stakeholders, but that was our primary one. Actually, just trying to get the research question took us, myself and my colleague, we thrashed around it for an hour, because we'd gone in with that concept that something wasn't working and we wanted to find the evidence to back up that something wasn't working, but actually just trying to figure out what that research question was as an outcome, not just as simple as is it working, is it not, but what we wanted to test it against. Took us a long time, because it made us come back to keep an open mind, because you either go into something because you think something's working and you want to prove it, or something isn't working, you want to prove that as well. But it's how that question actually just made us come back to make sure that we kept an open mind. And the questions that we used to do that, we based on standard 12 in terms of that flexibility of budget. So we translated some of the SDS standards into kind of bite-sized pieces of research questions underneath the overarching outcome. But I know you touched on it earlier, Des, but the independent support that we had through Jane Scott was completely invaluable, and I don't think we'd have got to some of the bits, because we'd gone into it knowing that it didn't quite work and it wasn't quite working. But actually, by having that focus to think something isn't working and we'll try and fix it, number one, you try to run to fix it mode really quick, because we've got limited time and resource. So again, the framework supported us to come back about 50 steps. But also Jane and the probing questions that she asked when we met with her made us realise that actually not everything was bad, but we'd become so blinkered with something that didn't work that we started to only see the negative and not the positive. So actually having that reflection on the entire process, and that then helped us populate the questions that we asked to unpaid carers, rather than them being kind of leading questions, but keep them very open-minded. So I think, to allay some people's fears, the self-evaluation for us actually made us keep an open mind. It made us identify all the stakeholders, but it also made us identify what it was that we was trying to achieve in a really clear document of what we was trying to set out, which supported to get, going back to your initial question, Margaret, supported us to get the buy-in from all parts of the system, because it was really clear how every part of the wider system fitted into what we was trying to do, finance in terms of budget, etc. So it supported that buy-in to kind of go back 50 steps instead of trying to go straight into fix-it mode.
Thanks, Michelle. And yeah, and a really helpful point. Just to hear that in the detail that you give and your experience of it is about the confidence to find the right place to start, and how that kind of came about. And I think you helpfully really highlighted how that's part of the governance, is that you're really beginning to open that out and people feeling confident to do that. Jane Kellock, once again, I've failed in my timeline. Sorry, it's already 11 o'clock, but can I hand back to you? Sorry.
I think that's absolutely fine, Des. Hopefully, folks can just hang fire another couple of minutes. A couple of points that came out there. What Ian said about the performance paradigm creating heat, far too much heat and no light at all, I think is really telling. And then what Michelle said about the self-evaluation approach, making the learning approach, making you more rigorous and not less, kind of turns that question that was asked earlier on its head. The assumption that some form of performance-based evaluation is actually more rigorous than self-evaluation. And I wonder if there's something there about the paradigm of the learning approach itself. As Des said, if performance drives gaming and defensiveness, if you're
shifting away from that, and it is radical. I think all of the areas that were involved in the testing of the self-evaluation approach realised just how radical that shift is. It's not just a simple thing. You're really having to change the way that you are in the world as a person, as a worker, because we're so embedded in the paradigm of performance. So if you can create that safe space to develop trust with a staff group, and if no one's being judgy, then there's no driver to avoid what's difficult or not going well. And people can start to safely say, actually, I know we should be doing it this way, and I know this is what we say we do, but actually what really happens on the ground is this. And these things start to kind of lift up, and people are trusted to express that. So a lot of patience, a lot of safe space, and I think we're very aware of that in the work that we're doing, and we're hoping we'll take that forward into the next financial year with a new group of local areas who are willing to kind of join us on that journey and build in those things that Des talked about. I had one more point about leadership, which was the sense of leaders needing to lead from the front. And there's also a sense that I'm getting, it's just mine at the moment, but it's about the kind of level, because we're mostly still in hierarchical leadership systems. It's that the kind of level at which the leaders lead from the front is, if you like, the area that you get improvement embedded in. So if you've got somebody driving change who is sitting at maybe front line, no matter how enthusiastic they are and how knowledgeable they are, if they're sitting at a kind of lower level of a hierarchical organisation, the capacity that they will have to make change that sticks is going to be really limited. You know, if they're saying, oh yeah, our leaders are right behind us, well, my question is, well, just how far behind you are they? You know, are they actually seeing what needs to be seen and driving the sort of change that needs to be driven? Finally, on the question of a broken system, I just want to reassure people that think somehow that there is no appreciation of that at a kind of national level. In the post-legislative scrutiny process of the SDS Act that you'll know is on the go at the moment, a group of 4 of us were invited to go and speak informally to the Scottish Parliament Health, Social Care and Sport Committee, just to start to begin that conversation with stakeholder groups about self-directed support. And the messages that really came through from all 4 of us, and that was me representing the social work workforce, someone representing social care sector, someone representing carers, and someone representing supported people. The message that we were all putting forward is SDS is the right way to go, but the system's broken. So we're hoping that, you know, as the submissions start to come into that, in that post-legislative scrutiny process, the lid will come off in a sense, and there won't be a way of kind of hiding behind that kind of sense of, well, we're just not doing it well enough, and that it is still okay. So we need to kind of tailor that message so that people still, you know, people at that level kind of get the message that SDS is the right way to go. Choice and control, the transfer of choice and control to people is the right way to go. But the system really needs a radical overhaul. So that's all from me. I want to thank Des hugely again for being such a good support to the self-directed support project within Social Work Scotland. I think that was a really excellent session today. I'm so glad we've been recording it. And we look forward to working with you all in the new year and going forwards. I wish you all a very happy holiday period, and I hope you get a chance to have a bit of a rest. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks.